Hi class, this is Mr. Stewart, your instructor for the CRJ 171 Security Risk Management course, and this is going to be the mini lecture for Chapter 2. And Chapter 2 is actually entitled Asset Identification and Security Inventories. So in last chapter we talked kind of at length about this big picture view of security and how it's driven by data, and what cannot be measured cannot be managed. So upon understanding that, now it's important that we look at how we go about identifying assets and conducting security inventories. So assets are considered to be anything of value, anything that means something to the company, to the agency, to whoever is needing security. Anything that has value to them is an asset. This could be a physical object. It could be a particular person. It could be the manufacturing apparatus, the machines that make whatever the product is. If you can't make the product, you can't sell the product. If you can't sell the product, you can't make money. It could be a formula. It could be a recipe, if you will. For example, for Kentucky Fried Chicken, the Colonel's Secret recipe for fried chicken is an asset that is carefully guarded and under high security at all times. The president of the company is considered an asset. The information system structure is considered an asset. So almost everything that has any value, or not almost everything, but everything that has value to the company could be considered an asset. So all security programs are therefore designed to protect said assets. That's why we have security. If you have an identified asset and it needs protecting, then you have some sort of security program, security procedure, or security person, professional, to protect that asset. So assets must be able to be identified, and then we have to, once we've identified an asset, we have to look at how critical that asset is to the business. And what we mean by criticality is how important is this asset. If we lose this asset, is it going to stop us in our tracks? Or if we lose this asset, is it simply just going to be, a nuisance for a particular period of time? KFC lost their secret recipe to Kentucky Fried Chicken, and let's say that Mrs. Winters' business was going down, and now that they were able to get a hold of the KFC recipe, and they just changed their recipe, and now people start hearing about how good the chicken is in Mrs. Winters, then people start going there, and they've taken an element of business away from KFC. So that will be considered a critical asset. In Chapter 1, I told you about an example of somebody stealing toilet paper. Toilet paper is an asset because the loss of said toilet paper can cause a loss of profit for the company. But would that be considered a critical asset? Well, it depends on how you look at it, I guess. If you're the employee that's in the bathroom and you need the toilet paper, yes, that's a critical asset. But to the company, they would look at the loss of said toilet paper. Is the loss of this toilet paper a critical loss? Is it going to cause us to stop in our tracks? Probably not. If they don't have toilet paper, they can always send somebody down to the dollar store to get, a case of toilet paper. But if they lose something that is much more important to the company, they may not be able to function. So just understand that criticality is simply how important it is to that asset is to that particular company. In your textbook on pages 12 through 14, there's a list of definitions. Now, I'm not going to tell you to memorize those definitions, but you do need to have a working knowledge of that terminology, because that is kind of the terminology in regard to security that we're talking about. Some of those words you've heard before. Some of them you probably already know what they mean. Some of them you may not have heard before, and you may need to study them a little bit more. But it is important that you familiarize yourself with that list of definitions and terminology on 12 through 14 in your textbook. So let's talk for a few minutes about asset classification. Assets can be classified as people, they can be classified as property, they can be classified as information. And then any of those could also be classified as that critical asset. And the book's definition of a critical asset is anything that is critical to the organization based upon the value as defined by the organization and the short or long-term consequences for loss or damage of that asset. In layman's terms, what that means is how important is that asset to us in our day-to-day operations? If we lose that asset, is it a big deal or not so big deal? If it's a not so big deal, it's not a critical asset. It's just an asset. If it's a big deal, that's a critical asset. In 1986, Space Shuttle Discovery lifted off, and about a minute or so into the flight, it blew up. We lost some critical assets with that particular explosion. We lost a spacecraft, which was worth who knows what, how many hundreds of millions or even $1 billion. Plus, we lost 6 astronauts who we had invested lots of time, lots of money, lots of training. They were considered, the astronauts are typically considered best of the best in regard to pilots and knowing their stuff in regard to rocket science. So when we lost that put a kind of a hiatus for at least a short period of time on our space program. We had to go back and look and see what caused this loss. This was a critical asset. This was several critical assets, and we lost that critical asset. So how can we mitigate this loss? And that means, how can we keep it from happening again? How can we reduce our liability? How can we protect ourselves from something similar happening, a second time? So just understand that there's a difference between an asset and a critical asset. How do we identify critical assets? Well, you can obtain critical asset lists from those who manage the day-to-day operations of the organization. For one, they're going to tell you what's important to make this business work. So once they tell you what's important to make this business work, you need to go about figuring out how to secure that and prevent it from being vulnerable to loss. If you don't have that list, you can conduct interviews to obtain the necessary information about each particular asset to determine how critical it is to the business. Because you may have something that you don't think is critical to the business that somebody else thinks that is, and if they can prove it is, then it probably needs to go higher on that prioritized list of assets. The security consultant or professional definitely needs to understand the process and the procedures of the organization, how they do business, what they feel is important, because then they can customize their security program around the assets that this company has deemed to be critical. The security consultant really doesn't need to be the one to make the decision as to what assets are critical. They simply need to find out which assets are critical and then develop the security program to reduce liability and prevent vulnerability to those assets. Because the security consultant's not good. You may have a security consultant that knows everything there is to know about security, but they know nothing about, let's say for KFC, let's say they know nothing about the fried chicken industry. That doesn't mean they can't be an excellent security consultant. Sure they can. They just need to go talk to the right people to determine what the critical assets are for that company, and then devise a security program and procedures to make sure that that company is protected. That's why a security consultant could theoretically work for anybody, because they know what there is to know about how to protect assets. They just need to be provided with a list of what the assets are. And if there is no list of assets, they can work with the company to help the company determine what their critical assets are, because it may be a small company and they may not necessarily know what their critical assets are. So the security consultant, by having experience in security, can definitely look at the company, find out what's important to them, and then prioritize that list of critical assets to which ones should be protected more heavily and first. Some asset information may be even available off the internet, and this is, believe it or not, this is also the same process that terrorists use. Terrorists will identify critical assets for whoever it is that they want to cause terror to, and then they will therefore begin to target the ones that they think are most vulnerable. It happens the same with private corporations, the same with government entities, the same with countries. Whatever that country has that is most vulnerable is what will be targeted by the people that want to cause problems for that particular entity. Look at the 9/11 attacks here in the United States. The terrorists knew that it was pretty hard to get some major weaponry into our country, but they thought somebody had a bright idea. Let's use an airplane as a weapon, especially if it's full of fuel, and let's hit the business trade center of the free world. And that was the World Trade Centers in New York City. Almost every major financial corporation, banking corporation, mining corporation, I mean, you name it, had offices in the World Trade Center. And they were actually counting on a much more widespread level of destruction than what actually happened. If it wasn't for our finest firefighters and police officers and a lot of brave run-of-the-mill John Doe and Jane Smith citizenry in New York City, we would have had a much larger loss. They were also trying to hit what else they thought was critical. They thought they could take out the Capitol, the White House, the Pentagon, take out a lot of our leadership, and that we would not only be crippled from the commerce viewpoint, we'd also be crippled from a lack of leadership viewpoint, and then it would just be chaos. I think we actually responded very well to that attack. Yes, we suffered losses, but it could have been a lot worse than what it was. So that's just a practical example of how on not only can security people, but criminals, people that want to steal or destroy assets from a company, how they go about deciding what is a target. A target is another name for a critical asset. It's just from the adversarial perspective. If you're working for the company, it's a critical asset. If you're an enemy of the company or the entity or the government, it's a target. So keep that in mind. So from an adversarial perspective, assets are called targets, such as a nuclear plant for terrorists. It's a really good target for terrorists to hit a nuclear plant, because they know that if they destroy part of that nuclear plant, they can spread, or they can cause widespread destruction, long-term disease, death, etc., poisoning, you name it. Targets may not have the same value for an adversary as they do for the owner. And I also want you to understand that the adversary or the enemy of the company may look at a particular target, which is an asset, and it may be more critical for them or easier for them to hit than what the company believes that they are vulnerable. The company says, who wants to take this part of our company out? Well, that may be the part that the adversary has determined as accessible. It's vulnerable, and so they know that they can cause them some issues. So just understand that the value of the critical asset / target may not necessarily line up between the two entities, the people who are wanting it protected versus the people who are wanting to target that particular asset. So therefore, the asset value must not only be based on its mission critical value, but also on its target value. And that's why it's important for the security professional to think like the terrorist, or think like the enemy of the entity or enemy of the company, and said, okay, if I were the bad guy and I wanted to hurt you, I wanted to cripple you, how would I go about doing it, and what access do I have? And so then you need to determine that, for as far as this may be critical to the company, but it's not as quite as critical to the adversary. But something that may not be as critical to the company may be very critical to the adversary as far as what they have access to and what they can target. So that's why I say you have to make a prioritized list, and then you have to try to secure as much of that as possible, because there may be something that you think needs a lot more security than something else, but an adversary may say, well, I'm going to hit something that's maybe further down on their list because they're not protecting it as well. So keep that in mind as well. So terrorists, therefore, also consider such things as casualty and injury rates, damage to political landscape, disruption to operations, disruption to the economy, how much media attention they're going to get, impact on the reputation of the organization, employee morale, and even just what terrorists do best, create terror or fear. So just understand that you got to sometimes think like the adversary in order to better protect your assets. I'm going to talk about consequence analysis here for just a minute. Target selection is based on the likelihood of the consequences, i.e., it's easier to conduct a small-scale attack because the likelihood of consequences is smaller than it would be for a larger-scale attack. And that could be an attack on a company, an attack on a country, attack on an entity. It doesn't necessarily matter. You have to look at the analysis of the consequences. Many times terrorists will do something smaller because they know the likelihood that of retaliation. We would call it, from a governmental perspective, retaliation. From a corporate perspective, we would call it consequences. What are the consequences for you doing this? Versus if you did something really big and really huge, you're going to have more consequences to pay. You're going to have more retaliation versus something smaller, and they still get their idea. They still get their agenda pushed forward, whatever their agenda is. Such as, like, now, think about the 9/11 attack. That brought about major consequences because that was instrumental in us starting the war in Afghanistan and then leading us into the war in Iraq. Al-Qaeda perpetrated many attacks before and after 9/11 that were much smaller and had many lesser consequences. 9/11 wasn't the only attack that people in the United States have suffered. It's just that they weren't major attacks, and therefore there were much less consequences. Now, how do we go about trying to keep adversaries from attacking us, whether it be from the corporate world or the government world or even some private entity or whatnot? Well, we have to develop countermeasures. And the first step in developing countermeasures is identifying all your assets. And the second step involves inventorying what you're presently doing and determining how well it works. Is what you're doing for this particular asset, protecting this asset, is it making it less vulnerable? Is it working? Just understand that existing countermeasures may or may not be working. That's why it's important to constantly evaluate and modify whatever your existing countermeasures are. Keep this in mind. Think about 3 circles together, and in fact, I'll just draw it for you here for just a minute. I think this is important for you to see. This is on your PowerPoint, but I also think it's important. If you draw 3 circles, if you think about this first circle right here as the likelihood of a threat, this circle here as the criticality of an asset, and this circle over here as the vulnerability of your security system, anywhere these circles intersect provides a conduit or a likelihood that something may happen. The critical point right here is where all three intersect. If you have an asset that you have determined is highly critical to your organization, and then you look at what you're doing to protect it, and you find out that it's highly vulnerable to attack, and then you get information that that attack is likely, that's a bad problem for your company. That's the thing you need to work on, is that little area where those three circles intersect, because that's the place where the bad guys are going to get you. So keep that in mind. The remaining steps of security risk assessment involve various evaluations designed to analyze threats, vulnerabilities, and overall risks, as well as a suggested course of remediation. And what we're talking about here is we're going to spend a lot of time in this course looking at how we identify an asset, how we assess the risk, what all the different types of risk are, and how we can remediate that risk or mitigate that risk, how we can lower that level of risk. So each step is a systematic approach to determine the actual risk posed to any actual asset. And the final step is to evaluate the cost and the benefit of your effort. That's something you always have to do. You have to look at how much is it going to cost me to secure this particular asset. If it's going to cost more to secure it than it's worth, then you don't do anything. If it costs less to secure it than that asset is worth, you do engage in the securing of that particular asset. That's what we call performing a cost-benefit analysis. You weigh how much the cost is versus the benefits. Make sense? Okay. In a nutshell, guys, that's chapter 2. Please read that chapter, look at those definitions. If you have questions, please send me a message in Course Messages. Have a good day. Bye-bye.